Thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Aileen Ionescu-Summers. I am the Executive Director of Global Entrepreneurship Monitor, or GEM, as we like to call it. We always call it quite a gem of a project. What is GEM? GEM, if we could just put up the first slide, Kevin. I will talk very broadly about GEM before introducing our contributors today, our speakers. If you could just go back to the first slide. Yeah, just, very globally about GEM. It's a consortium of national country teams that are primarily associated with top academic institutions, and we carry out survey-based research on entrepreneurship around the world. In fact, GEM is the only global research source that collects data on entrepreneurship directly from the entrepreneurs themselves. So we cover two surveys, the adult population survey, which provides analysis on the characteristics, motivations, and ambitions of any individual that is starting a business, as well as the social attitudes of entrepreneurs towards entrepreneurship. And the second survey that we carry out is the National Expert Survey, or NES. So the first one was APS, and the second one is NES. NES is National Expert Survey. It looks at the national context in which individuals start businesses. Now, our survey tools produce data that benefit numerous stakeholder groups, which are academics, very important. Publications become very accessible with the kind of hard, rigorous methodologies and data that GEM employs. And then policymakers that mainly are governmental, but not only, research institutions, et cetera, entrepreneurs themselves that can get better knowledge on where to invest and where they can gain influence. And sponsors that we collaborate with to advance our organizational interests together, and international organizations such as OECD, World Bank, European Commission, whole range of organizations. Recently, we set up a new partnership with WIPO for the the Global Innovation Index, the GII. So we collaborate with quite a lot of external entities. Today, we're going to talk about hopefully two reports. First is GEM France, that has come out with its 2020-21 national report. Speaker today is the leader of the GEM France team, is Professor Frank Lasch. He is professor at Montpellier Business School. And hopefully Professor Terry-Ann Gaynor-Clark from GEM Jamaica, the leader of GEM Jamaica, professor at the University of Technology in Jamaica, will join us a little bit later. But we're going to start off with Frank. Could I hand you over to you, Frank, to present some highlights from the GEM France report? Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Aileen. Thanks, Kevin, for organizing this webinar, and thanks for all the people who were interested to look into together at the data about France and Jamaica. First of all, we have to say that we are a new team. So we took over the team GEM France only in 2021. So there has been a gap around 5 years where no French team has participated in the GEM exercise. That's why we have now done the first data collection since 2018. So we're the team from France, which is based in Montpellier, which has a quite large entrepreneurship research community. So this is a joint cooperation between the business school and the University of Montpellier, which I lead together with my colleague Karim Mesegem, who unfortunately could not join today. So what I would like to share today, it's the data from the APS and the expert survey from 2021. And given that we are currently finalizing our 222 report, I tried when I could complement these 221 data with some preliminary results. On the agenda, the choices for this very brief presentation, we would like to present some data about the French entrepreneurial ecosystem. Then we would zoom into the entrepreneurial activity in France, and also look a bit about motivations and also the perceptions of how entrepreneurship is perceived and maybe valorized in France. Then we took the choice in for the 221 surveys to define three special topics. We would wanted to have a more detailed information on female entrepreneurship, on the timely issue of sustainable development, and obviously, we would want to have more information about pandemic and entrepreneurship support. These are questions we added a bit in our surveys, and that complemented a bit the questions already that are already in the standard questionnaires. So first of all, when we look at the entrepreneurial ecosystem in France, what the experts tell us, and when you look here at the graph, France is in orange. So what the experts consider is that we rather have a national ecosystem that is positive and supportive. Here we have positive and a little bit less positive things. So what the experts consider as very positive, which would be a bit above the average of the other countries that we have participated in the 221 exercise, a very strong public policy and support that is very well perceived. We also see that entrepreneurship is highly promoted, strongly promoted in higher education. That the physical infrastructures are considered very good or excellent, and also that there is sufficient existence and access to finance. Also, the burden of administration, or is administration efficient? This has been answered positively. And so these are the dimensions where France maybe has some advantages in its ecosystem. On the other side, we have some issues about the promotion of entrepreneurship in rather primary and secondary education. So getting entrepreneurship more earlier to kids and young people, that is an issue in France. Also, we have a very huge gap in terms of social and cultural norms. And I could also add the market dynamisms. So these were the three things that the experts in France rated a bit more critically, and which indeed are looking at the average of all the participants, where France does a little bit less good. Quickly looking at the results for 222, we find more or less the same results. The perception of an effective research and development transfer is seen a bit more critically this year in the 222 data. This overall shows that France has made a good progress over time in terms of developing a supportive and a positive ecosystem for entrepreneurship. And when we look at the G7 countries, here France ranks in a quite good position in terms of the national ecosystem scores. So this is for setting a bit the context, and now we would look a bit more closer into the entrepreneurial activity in France. Here we have a bit of a first surprise or first specificity in France. We talked about the ecosystem, some specificities that are positively a bit more negatively perceived in France here. Just as an example, when about the ecosystem, I saw that the administration was not seen as a large burden. This surprised me a bit, because in France, that's a big issue, that administration is always a big burden, etc., and that is always criticized, but well, the experts didn't rate it so negatively. Here we have another example of where we see a quite specific case in France, a quite large of as we perceived it, a quite large intention-action gap. 60, close to 70% of our interviewees declared intention, so we want to create in the next future. That's on the 221 data, on average, that's a bit higher than the other G7 countries. But then when we look at what happens then in terms of early stage entrepreneurs and established entrepreneurs, we see that there is a very huge intention action gap. You have 70% of people who say, we want to create in the next future. But effectively then we have only close to 8%, 7.7%, who really take this next step and really engage in entrepreneurship. And that ranks France, as you see, on mid-level, but still below the G7 average in terms of TEA, and impressively last position in terms of established entrepreneurs. So on the one side, we see that looking over time means the last 10, 15 years, entrepreneurship is growing in France, becomes more democratized, let's say. That leads to better TEA levels, which are still modest when we compare it to the G7, but there is really an issue of sustainability. So what happens then in the development and survival of firms when you look at the midterm perspectives? So this very slow EBO level is a challenge and has to be analyzed critically by policy people. Maybe to explain this EBO level a bit, we have looked into the main reasons for exit in 2021. First of all, that was the COVID environment, the pandemic. Then many had profitability issues. Don't forget that in France, we have a very specific micro-firm environment. More than 95% of firms in France are micro-firms, and really very small micro-firms. That is an average much lower as compared to the other countries in Europe. Then another positive reason for exit this time, that's there are sufficient opportunities, so people go out of entrepreneurship and go back into employment, and some rate also indicate family reasons. Looking at the 222 data, we find the same order of importance, except pandemic, who obviously we have been at the end of the pandemic period in 2022. Pandemic falls then behind in terms of main reason for exit. So this is a bit what we see in the main result here, entrepreneurial activity in France. We see a very huge intention action gap. Let's now have maybe to explain this in a bit more fine-grained way. Is this linked maybe to the status of entrepreneurship in the country? We've seen that France has made a quite positive progress in terms of its road to an entrepreneurial society. Overall, over time, TEA rates are evolving, intention is evolving, even if we have this intention action gap still. So what can explain a bit these maybe these issues of sustainability, that we have a critical level of EBO? So when we look now at how entrepreneurship is perceived in France, is it a desirable career choice? Yeah, here we see that indeed more that the majority of people indicate that entrepreneurship has become over time really a desirable career choice. It's highly profiled in the media. So on an everyday basis, we see media evidence about successful entrepreneurship or entrepreneurship with difficulty because of pandemics. So this is in the everyday discussion. But when we look here at our results, while it has become a very desirable career choice, while it is highly valorized in the media, it does not lead to very highly perceived elevated status. So here, when we look at the comparison with the other countries in the G7, it confers the lowest elevated social status as compared to Italy, Japan, United States, Germany, or the UK. So that's a bit of a paradox. And maybe if we recall a bit what we found about the national ecosystem, that might confirm a bit the issues, the critical view of that there in France. Still, something is has to be done, has to be improved in terms of social and cultural norms that seem to evolve slowly, while the overall conditions are rather perceived as positive. So we have a rather supportive and positive national ecosystem, but still social and cultural norms lag a bit behind. Let's look now a bit on our special topics, the topics we wanted to put a bit more focus in our 221 report. We were very interested in terms of female entrepreneurship, participation of women in the economy is very important in France. So then this should lead obviously also to a higher participation of women into entrepreneurship. And this is indeed the case. When we look at the comparison with the other G7 countries, we see that while the TEA levels are quite modest, the gender gap is the smallest. So the difference between the TEE levels of male and women entrepreneurs. In the other countries, you have the ones who have very high TEA levels. Here you see that the gender gap is much more greater. Same also for those who have comparative entrepreneurial activity, figures like Germany, Japan, and Italy. So this is true for early stage entrepreneurs. It's a bit, and this is the second half, bottom of the graph. It's a bit less true for the established entrepreneurs, where we have still quite important gender gap from 6.1 male to 2.9 women. So meaning that maybe new generations of entrepreneurs might solve in the future, or might also then translate over into a smaller gender gap in the established entrepreneurs. So women are more and more present in entrepreneurship. Women participate more and more in creating new firms or in engaging with entrepreneurship. And this hopefully will signal for the future that also women will be more and more present in managing established enterprises. When we look at the 222 data, we see that this still is true. So this, I would not say equality, but this closeness of levels between men and women in terms of participation is in entrepreneurship. However, we see that while the TEA rates are stable for women, they have increased for male. So they have increased for male from 8.4 to 11.1%. So the gender gap widens a bit looking at our 222 data, but in the European comparison with the G7 countries, France is still one of the best positioned G7 countries in terms of gender equality, in terms of participation in entrepreneurship. What do women report differently from men? In our 221 survey, they report a slightly higher fear of failure and a lower perceived capabilities. They also report that they more often than men that they are that they can easily spot opportunities, but they report that they less than seize these opportunities as compared to men. Again, when we look when we compare with the other 6 countries in Europe of the G7, in France, women report the highest levels of satisfaction with support services, childcare, elderly care, all the help aid, also financial aid that helps women to engage in employment or in the economic life, in the entrepreneurial life. Here we have a very strong support system in France, and they also say that they feel that the equal access to finance is is well perceived. So second of all the G7 countries, where women say that they have quite equal access to finance as compared to men. On average, here they say, well, national culture is favorable, but only looking at the G7 comparison, here France ranks on average. And that links maybe back to what we already identified, these issues about social and national culture and norms that might lag behind or might still merit a development in France. On the contrary, where France ranks last in the G7 comparison, that has been the perceived negative impact of teleworking during the pandemic. So the fact that people were forced to work from home, this was more difficult or perceived more difficult for women as compared to men. So there might be also an issue of a work-family balance. And again, maybe this signals or echoes again what we have already observed. So the slowly evolving social and cultural norms in France. So here we find a bit not a confirmation, but we see that there is something in the French culture that can still evolve to make entrepreneurship and female entrepreneurship more easy for the participants. Let's now move from female entrepreneurship to the next special topic. Here we looked at sustainable entrepreneurship. What we found here, first, a positive message of now over time, indeed, there is a change of paradigm. So the awareness that of environmental and social impacts of economic and entrepreneurship activity is growing over time. But again, as for the intention action gap in terms of entrepreneurial activity, we see here a very wide gap between the awareness that it's important to consider environmental and social impacts, and then the effective implementation of these actions. So the difference between this, the first bar, what is here called prise en compte, that is awareness, and the second bar, which is mise en œuvre, meaning that we put this into action. So that's a quite huge gap. Emergent entrepreneurs say we are aware that it's important to consider environment and societal issues in our activities, 69%. And then, yeah, when you ask, yeah, but what do we put in place? It's only 24% that say we do something, we put something in place. And we have a similar gap for established entrepreneurs, but this gap is more reasonable. Also, when we compare on the left side environment and on the right side social, we understand that in France, sustainability is more understood, or the issue of sustainability is more addressed in terms of environmental than social dimensions. That might be explained by French regulation. I don't know if you've ever seen the French labor law volumes. That is such big. And often when you talk with entrepreneurs, they say, yeah, but we don't need to take more actions about the social dimension of our activities, because so many things are already defined in the labor laws. So maybe this that can be explained by already high regulation in terms of labor laws, and also quite a strict regulations in terms of environmental concerns. We have to dig into this to confirm this idea. When we look again at the G7 comparison, we see that France has made quite some progress, but still reports only average levels of awareness, and lags indeed behind in implementation of environmental and social actions, or reported implementation of environmental and social actions, where France ranks last in the G7 comparison. Let's now move to our last special topic that we developed in our report. Obviously, it was important to all the stakeholders to report findings, provide insight on the effect of pandemic and related entrepreneurship support. Just to provide some context, in France, 230 billion euros have been mobilized in terms of financial support measures to cope with the pandemic. So that's a huge sum. Most of the early stage entrepreneurs also report that COVID didn't make starting their business much more difficult. And we see that as a consequence of this, France scores quite high on the perceived effective government response just after UK and Canada. But we see differences between early stage firms and more established firms. So the perception of established firms or established entrepreneurs is much more favorable. That indeed the government response was adaptive, efficient, and quick. That has been much less perceived by the early stage entrepreneurs. And indeed, after the first round of support measures in France, policy and government realized that they were much more adapted for established firms as compared to very, very young firms who maybe had not yet a record of income, of turnover, and then they just didn't fit into the support schemes. So this has been a bit corrected in the support measures, but still we see that it has been positive for the established firms and a little bit less effective for the early stage entrepreneurs that have not a set of credibility, a set of routines, a set of legitimacy. So maybe this can also be explained by that newness, with the problem of newness and as compared to the established entrepreneurs. Maybe one last word. I don't know, Aileen, if Terry has joined. If I shall take some time, or if we shall go to the questions, answers, discussions, or.
So Terry has not joined us. I can only presume that there's a fairly major connectivity issue. And therefore, thank you very much, Frank. It's a really, really interesting set of slides. For anyone who wants to know, I think we can make these slides available, can we, Frank?
Of course. Mm.
Yeah, okay, we will make that available to the people who've signed up for the webinar. I'll just kick off with a few questions, but I'm very happy for anyone out there to put your question in the Q&A, and we'll try and field those questions also. I actually thought there was very interesting gaps there, and I wondered, I mean, I'm living in an adjacent country to France, and I know that perception can be reality, Frank, and I know that for many years there was a perception that in France entrepreneurship was very difficult, very bureaucratic process to enter into. And the experts seem to be saying, well, no, actually, it does seem that has loosened up and it's become easier. But I wonder, is there a kind of lag time in the perception of people? And that might be affecting also the issues around passing from intention to action in terms of creating a business. What do you think about that? Do you have some views?
Yeah, definitely. If we also look at the other indicators, and that's what we discussed in the team, we see that really. Remember the first time France participated in the GEM? That was 20 years ago. It ranked last of all countries in terms of entrepreneurial activity, in terms of whatever you can imagine. Yeah. And now we see rather that France has a good average position across many indicators. So there is indeed a change in. There has been a change in culture and a change in entrepreneurial activity.
Change, actually.
A massive change, and we see that entrepreneurship is now discussed on an every day. Every day you hear about entrepreneurship. 10 years ago, nobody talked about entrepreneurship in France, not in the media. So this is a change. We see this also in the figures. even during COVID, we had the highest ever recorded number of new firms started per year. For the first time, over 1 million. So over time, that is a really factual evidence that France is on a very good road towards an entrepreneurial society. That people on the individual level engage with the also it has become a motivation, a real career option. Honestly, 10, 15 years in my courses, when I talk to my students, I ask them about their future projects. Well, 1 out of 20 said, I want to start up a firm. Now I see raising hands, 5, 10 in a class. So indeed,
Right.
there is this evolution, positive evolution, but as we have already observed, there is indeed this perception gap
Yes.
between the individual engagement with entrepreneurship. We see in France, for example, we have many hybrid entrepreneurs. We have many people that test entrepreneurship, thanks to government schemes like auto entrepreneurship. So you can complement your income with a small entrepreneurial activity without getting into too much tax issues that it will ultimately become unprofitable, accumulating an employed and a self-employed activity. So people go in and out. Say they often stay a bit longer in hybrid entrepreneurship as compared to, for example, Germany, where many people go into hybrid entrepreneurship, but they don't stay there very long.
Yeah.
That's what we have seen in other data sets. So there is a sort of entrepreneurial culture evolving where people individually see it as an opportunity, but maybe then given this learning process that they go in and out, and many of these firms are micro firms, what we could call everyday entrepreneurship, then the individual experience is less well perceived as you would perceive it from an aggregate perspective, being a national expert. Because you would see things are very positive, evolving aggregately, but when you speak individually with people, yeah, some have more
Very
difficult
local.
experiences. Some like entrepreneurship, even if it doesn't lead to higher income, but they like the autonomy, they like the freedom. Other have the opportunity in France that the alternative employment opportunities exist.
Yes.
And then they say, okay, maybe there is the question of entrepreneurship. How do I position this over my life cycle? Maybe it's easier to do it before I have kids or before I get married, before I have constraints. Then maybe better shift to alternative employment, which would guarantee me a higher income. These are certainly the fluctuations that we have to look into by mobilizing more data. So this is what, indeed, I would say there's a certain gap that could explain these the perception, the different perceptions on an individual and a more aggregate level. Absolutely true, and also the evolution of social and cultural norms. We see it clearly in the data. Women participate more and more in entrepreneurship,
Yeah, so things
but
are
are
changing.
still less present in managing firms. So this gap is still a bit wider. But this could be a very nice example of time lag.
Yeah,
Because if
absolutely.
entrepreneurship becomes more and more democratized, if it becomes more and more desirable career choice, then obviously we would expect also that this translates into many other dimensions of the economy and of in the established entrepreneurship. However, we also realize that we often talk about two worlds of entrepreneurship. The world of everyday entrepreneurship that is not so much reported and seen in the media. Media often like to tell success stories or narratives of growth entrepreneurship, of high-tech entrepreneurship, of new innovative entrepreneurship. This is what we see much more often in the media as the everyday forms of entrepreneurship. And that is a common observation also in our research. When we look about research and entrepreneurship, it's much more about these successful or growth-oriented types of entrepreneurship and much less about what Friederike Welter and colleagues some years ago termed everyday entrepreneurship.
Okay, yes, very interesting. And another, the other major gap that you pointed to was the difference between the awareness and the action gap in sustainability, in the area of sustainability. And I guess, having done a lot of research in sustainability, corporate sustainability, awareness, so all of that myself, I think there is a social desirability bias when people are asked, do they incorporate these considerations into their strategies or into their intentions? And people usually reply, because they want to be socially desirable, yes. But then the proof of the pudding is with the action, right? Would you agree with that? Or
Obviously, there is certainly a positive response bias.
yes.
That you, of course, you're enthusiastic about your firm to say, of course, you take this into account, and that then when you hand in the next question, yeah, what do you do exactly? Then there is a gap. However, when as we compared it with the other countries in the G7, we see that this gap is quite larger than compared to the other 6 countries in the
Okay.
G7. So
Okay.
that corrects maybe a bit for the response bias, but I would guess in all the countries this response bias exists. But in France,
Absolutely. Yes.
there we have response
So there's a
bias
notable extra issue. Yeah.
plus the extra
Yes.
what do you then put into action. We discussed it in the team. We hadn't the time to triangulate this with more with other databases and other sources. France is a highly regulated country.
Yeah.
I think it has become easy to start up a business now, thanks to effective administration, less administrative burdens, digitalization of many steps you have to take. So this has become easier. But I think the challenge for entrepreneurs in France is get familiar with the regulation. There are so many things you have to take into account when you open the door of entrepreneurship and become
Yeah.
your own entrepreneur, and your firm has to comply with all this regulation.
Yeah.
And speaking with some entrepreneurs, they often give the same answer. Yeah, but it's already done because we have to comply with environment regulation 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and we anyway well-being of employees or the care for employees, that is an obligation. It's in the social regulation of the labor laws number 5, 6, 6, 7, 8. So maybe that is why also we have this additional gap, that many things are already covered in the regulation,
and it
and
becomes
then
a compliance-driven.
they think, well, it's less the necessary issue. However, we see the difference between the early stage entrepreneurs, where the gap is greater, and the established entrepreneurs. So maybe the established entrepreneurs indeed, or it's maybe a confirmation of this suggestion, they had the time to comply with all these obligations. While those who are just in the phase of starting up, these priorities are getting the new firm on a survival trend, and then over time, when more and more employees come, then they maybe have to take care more and more with environmental constraints, given that they pass maybe a threshold, or with more the social dimensions.
Yes.
But again, these are signals that we have to verify in discussions and with other data. But it would make sense.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Just reminding our audience that you can put your questions in the Q&A. I have another question for Frank, however. So you talked of aspects that the entrepreneurs should be taking into account, but I'm just wondering, have you already shared your findings with policymakers, and how did they react? Or if you have not yet, then how do you think policymakers should be thinking with these results?
We have made a first press conference. The audiences were rather journalists.
Yeah.
So they have been interested in the evolution of entrepreneurship in France. Given that this was our first report, we hadn't yet time to engage into much discussion with policymakers. I think this will happen with the next two reports, when we become really visible in the national scene as experts in terms of GEM surveys and GEM results. On the other side, our first report has drawn interest. We have now two major partners. So the Investment Bank of France sponsors now partially our work, and also a major insurance company. And they have very important networks, and they're very well linked with policy. So we hope that thanks to these new cooperations, that we can engage stronger with policymakers. Well, local and regional policymakers, they would rather be interested in more findings on the region and the area around Montpellier. But the GEM data is first, given the samples, important for the national audience. So here also we are currently maybe in discussions with making maybe regional extensions. So this is still our work in progress to get more in touch with policymakers, to make them react to these different issues. So here we still have some work to do.
So, well, in other words, you've covered more or less how you plan to leverage the report during the year. When I say leverage, I mean how you're going to actually bring this report to the attention of the appropriate stakeholders.
Yeah, a first step already was this very positive response of additional participation and funding with these two organizations I just mentioned, and I think it's getting into the national networks.
Okay, all right.
Via the organizations that are interested in, then the relay is much more easier, and also, well, I think 2021 in France. The environment was still very COVID dominated. So the message of a new report about entrepreneurship in France maybe got a bit drowned into the everyday problems and issues related to the pandemic. So we hope also that from this that we're now much more audible in a context that is less where we're now at the end of the pandemic. So this also affected a bit our interactions and our work.
Okay, what would be your vision for the future for GEM France and the GEM research in France? What's the ideal sort of dynamic in terms of the interface between policymakers, public, and the entrepreneur?
Yeah, we would like to get, and we did some. We are in the process of getting more and more in interaction and feedback loops about our results, because we would like also to have more input from external stakeholders to put additional questions. For example, in our APS questionnaire. So we're currently discussing with these two organizations what would you be interested in that we could, for example, in our data, verify with a specific GEM methods approach.
Okay.
And this, maybe we can get some questions already into the APS of this year, 2023. And but definitely it will have an impact in the next year's surveys.
Okay, great. Well, we're not getting so many questions. I do have one, but I'm not quite sure whether we can really help with that, since we have this webinar is based on the research from the APS and the NES. The question is, would you give us tips about business incubation support for entrepreneurship? Which is a wide question, and I don't really think we can help with that mechanism, because it's very specific outside. But do you have a comment on that,
Well,
Frank?
in France, in general, the importance of incubators, or entrepreneurship support in general, how can I say it? It's a bit a blessing and a curse. Because in France, you have a massive entrepreneurship support, but it is so numerous and so various that often entrepreneurs support that they're a bit lost and drowned. So on the one side, you have I don't know, some years ago, I made a seminar with people from the Chambers of Commerce, and they told us, yeah, in France, if we simply count all kinds of measures for entrepreneurship support and incubation, tax reliefs, training, whatever, if you take them all together, there are more than 3,000.
How do you
7, 8 years ago. So
Yes.
it's really there is really a whole segment of the entrepreneur ecosystem who deals with this. How can we help entrepreneurs benefit from entrepreneurship support? Because it's difficult to get an overview. And second, we have a quite I think quite interesting incubation system in France. Also very diversified. In Montpellier, for example, you have the Business Incubation Center, which is regularly ranked one of the best in the world. I don't know according to which ranking. So we have these. There are all kinds of incubators for different types of entrepreneurial activity. Probably much more about high-tech entrepreneurship and innovative entrepreneurship, because incubators select growing and promising projects. Then for everyday entrepreneurship, I think that entrepreneurs reach out rather for financial measures and less for incubating. Okay, what now exactly could I recommend you about getting incubation and support for starting up a firm in France? Well, that depends on your project. Obviously, every entrepreneur project is different.
Yes.
But I think get very early in touch with the entrepreneurship support system, and they now have many soft lending schemes for foreign investment and foreign entrepreneurs.
I think I hope you found that helpful. Thank you very much, Frank. Kevin, maybe we could just put up the last two slides. First of all, I'd like to thank you very, very much, Frank, for giving us some of your time today. I know you're a very busy person. And just connect with us on Twitter, Facebook, or LinkedIn. Visit us on the website, or send us if you're interested, or if anyone you know is interested in the potential for joining GEM as a national team, then please do reach out to us at the email address on the slide. Thank you very, very much indeed for joining us today, and we'll see you hopefully at the next webinar.